And good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can see me there. Welcome. I'm Neil Sikora, the president of Wild Ones Kalamazoo Area Chapter. Last week it was 70 degrees. This week we had a dusting of snow, and tomorrow is supposed to be back up to 60 degrees. So this is definitely fall in Southwest Michigan. So for this month's virtual background, I've selected a recent photo of the fallen leaves in my yard. I really like the palette that shows up every fall. I hope you're still able to get out and enjoy the outdoors while you can. For our Kalamazoo area chapter members, we are nearing our annual chapter elections. We still have an opening for a vice president and a member at large. If you enjoy these great programs and our excellent Seedlings newsletter, we need your participation to keep these things going. So please consider getting involved at this level. You can get more information about the openings by contacting one of us, by visiting our website, checking the Seedlings newsletter, sending an email to info@kalamazooWildOnes.org, or sending a message to our Facebook page. And I'll put that information in the chat box too, in case you want to check it out later. When the slate is finalized, chapter members will get an email with voting instructions sometime probably within the next month. Tonight's program is being recorded and will be available on our Kalamazoo Area Wild Ones YouTube channel, where you can also find our September and October programs. Check them out and share them with family and friends who are interested in native plants and with people who are but don't know they are yet. Please be sure to keep your audio setting to mute during the meeting and throughout the meeting. If you would like to ask a question to the speaker, please use the chat button that you find at the bottom of your screen. We'll assemble the questions and ask our speaker to answer as many as possible during the available time. Now I'd like to introduce Mike Klug, who will introduce this evening's speaker.
Thanks, Neil. Tonight's speaker is David Mindell. David is the founder and owner of PlantWise in Ann Arbor. His business is dedicated to restoring native ecosystems and plant communities. Prior to establishing PlantWise, David was the stewardship coordinator for the City of Ann Arbor's Natural Area Preservation Division and urban forester for the greening of Detroit. The title of his presentation tonight is You Planned and Planted, Now What? He will give us some insight into effectively managing and maintaining native landscapes. David?
Thanks, Mike, and thank you all for the invitation to be here and join you all tonight. Great. So, yeah, we in the native plant and native landscaping world, we talk frequently about planning and planting, but maybe a little bit less so about what you do after you've created and planted your landscapes. And so I wanted to chat about some various approaches and techniques and concerns and considerations as we think about that. And I encourage you guys to ask questions as we go, if there's something pertinent to a topic that I'm talking about. In thinking about how to chat about maintenance and management of our native landscapes, I broke it down into a few different topics. Thinking about what aesthetic you're looking to have in your landscape. There's such a wide range between, the wildness of a prairie and the tidiness of a more traditional type of a landscape aesthetic. And one of the questions always around planting a native landscape is, as you design it, are you thinking that the designed appearance is the final appearance, or is that simply the jumping off point for whatever is going to emerge in the succession process that typically occurs in a garden setting? And then I wanted to talk about various plant health issues. As we plant our gardens, oftentimes some things really thrive incredibly well, some things not so much. In where's the temporal component fit in? How much is it just a matter of patience in terms of kind of what we what we expect to see. Maybe we need to wait. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about techniques for site management, including things like fire, hand pulling, and herbicide use, spraying, cutting and mowing, those types of things, and the positives and negatives of associated with each of these techniques. So to jump in and to start to look at the question of aesthetics. So this is an example of a site that we did adjacent to Mott Community College in Flint. And on the right side of the screen, you see the patch of turf. And that turf patch had extended in maybe another 6 feet or so. And it was a low-lying wet area that it was impossible to mow because it was so wet. And so the college agreed to kind of transition that into a wetland planting, and they were happy to have it as a wilder appearance. But one of the things that they felt like they wanted to have was really a rich diversity of wildflowers in there, so that there was clarity to passersby that it wasn't a neglected area, that it was an intentional planting. And so in this case, and as you know, as many of us do, we really thought to include species that flowered across the entire growing season in a site that would look wonderful in the winter as well, since this particular area would not get mowed down. So that's kind of, you know, on the wilder side of things. And then this is more urban setting in the Ann Arbor Skate Park, where again we were looking for something that was functional. This is a rain garden where all the skate park elements drain off into, all the cement drains off into these rain gardens. So we wanted to be functional, but we also wanted it to have again an intentional look, and that was an easy thing early on in the process, and obviously more challenging as the plants grew and established. And so again, kind of that question of at what stage are we looking in terms of the design? Are we thinking kind of longer term and what the site might look like down the road? One more example, and this is moving towards the neater aesthetic. We were asked to design and install a planting in a condo association courtyard, and they had just pulled out a bunch of plantings that they didn't like at all. This is kind of what we inherited, and so we, you know, created a nice, neat bed edge. We mulched it, and then we planted that site. And the main consideration that they had, because of a funding source that they were able to work with, was that the site be a pollinator habitat, and in particular, a monarch butterfly rich habitat. So they asked that we include such things as common milkweed, butterfly milkweed, and then patches of bee balm. And we talked a lot about it because we also told them that it's, you know, these are pretty aggressive plants that they are interested in having included in the planting, and that the plants are not going to stay in one place. And so one of the things that they agreed to was, in order to keep some greater semblance of neatness, that they would have us back twice a year to pull and cull and edit the site, so that, you know, in areas, you know, back in the corners, we would allow things like the common milkweed to hang out, but where it jumped up into the front of the planting, we would pull those plants and keep it really kind of pushed back, and they were happy with that compromise of sorts. obviously there's still a wild aesthetic to it, and they recognize that given a pollinator planting and a monarch planting, that this was kind of what they were going to end up seeing, almost by default. And I wanted to show you another example of a site that we transformed, and some of the thinking that went into how we managed it following this. So you can see we're looking a little bit more uphill in the distance, and so I'm standing at a lower point, and these folks drained much of the neighborhood from that was uphill in the background of this image, and all the water kind of ends up in this area in the foreground. So as a point of reference, you'll see the stairs that are over here, and the corner of the screened-in porch is here. And these next couple of images you can see some of the change associated with those areas. So again, here's the corner of the screened-in porch. The stairs are here, and here again is the corner of the screened-in porch. So that first photo was kind of taken from this perspective. So these clients were really interested in having walkways that bisected and would take them out into the wildness, and they wanted a degree of wildness, but they also wanted it again to be manicured and culled over time. And so it's a site where we have continued to go back and make sure that no individual species overruns the others. And one of the things that we did in the early stage of this, you'll see this pool of water here. I'm gonna show you a video here that kind of takes you through this landscape just a little bit. So there are a couple elements that I wanted to kind of point out in that, and that you may have noticed. One was that some of the edges of the paths, there's swaths of bare soil. The other was that the channels where the rainwater was flowing were lined with gravel. And so one of the issues that we were trying to deal with right away was to use the water as a resource and keep it on site as much as possible. But there was so much water that we needed to move it around the landscape. And we realized that if we had left all the channels that carried the water from one area to another unprotected, and I thought I might have had a picture in here. Sorry, I think I don't. That the soil would wash away, and so we lined all the channel areas with gravel to stabilize the soils there. The other thing that we did was, and you can see it in this still here, that the edges, the path edges, and the high points still have some bare and exposed soil. And we realized that we weren't going to be able to mulch some of these areas because the water level would change so dramatically that the mulch would wash away. And so we kept uh, we kept those areas exposed. We put in an initial round of plugs of young plants to start to establish, and then we watched it through a couple rain events to see how the water level would change over time, and to modify the plants as needed. So there were some areas that we needed to change the grade in order to move water along more quickly. In some areas, we could make a little bit deeper to hold water a little longer. And by doing it in stages and holding off on putting some of the plants in the ground, we were able to ease the transition phases that came along as we needed to make those tweaks. So rather than plant everything in there and then need to change things significantly, we went with a kind of a graduated planting process so that we saw how the site changed with varied moisture conditions with different rain events. So it was kind of a phased planting made our overall management of that site a lot easier, and a lot less disruptive to the plant material that we put in there.
David, I might just ask a question
Yeah.
at this point. So when you say you did a phased planting or graduated planting process, like is that over a number of years or?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, we did that within about a 6-week period, so that
Okay,
we waited until we had some good rain events, and we saw what the rain did across the landscape. Um, and we tweaked and we added additional plants, and then we watched and waited again and saw how it changed. So we had an overall design in mind when we started the whole planting process, but we didn't. We implemented it in kind of 3 phases in order to see those changes, and it rolled out over about a 6-week period. We were
great.
lucky
That's great to see. So even over a season, you can do that within a season.
within a season. Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
And for some sites, those plant edits are a multi-year process as well, right? So that and as one of the other things that we'll get to here is some plants do better than others in different environments, and you think you know how a plant is going to respond, but every site is so unique. So there's always some need, or often some need, to do tweaking from year to year, even not just within a season.
Thank you.
So this is an example of a wilder site with a cultivated, in some sense, a cultivated aesthetic, and we uh, we created that. So this is one of the Ann Arbor Public Libraries, and we made it a tidier appearance simply by weed whacking a 2-foot swath along the edge of the sidewalk, rather than have the prairie species kind of crowd out and spill over. Um, we were looking to have a little bit more of a sense of order in this one particular area. So that it's kind of, it's clearly a wilder landscape, but um, with a slight modification. Joan Nassauer is a landscape architect at the University of Michigan, and she, I think, kind of coined this phrase "cues to care," which is, that idea of implementing some cue to care in your landscape, and that might be a bit of a split rail fence or a wild one sign that says, this is a planted landscape, or a bird feeder, or a mowed edge, and we try and implement those, particularly in more high visibility public areas. Another example of a wilder, I'd say a wilder aesthetic on the right, and what had been perhaps a little bit more of a cultivated aesthetic on the left, this planting started out as all little blue stem on the corner, and it was in order, in part, to maintain good sight lines for traffic. This prairie in the extension um, is nearby, and so I think a lot of the species that, in particular, prairie dock and common milkweed, migrated into this bed. And so one of the ongoing decisions that we as landscapers and gardeners and land stewards need to make is, uh, what do we want to allow to exist in a site, and how, uh, that again, that same sense of how much succession do we allow, and how static do we want to try and keep it in some situations. In this case, again, because of the visibility issues and sight lines, it's probably more important to think about pulling native species that have become weeds in this particular landscape. On the right side, the bigger issue is, how do we keep the vegetation out of the sidewalk? Um, and how much do we want to do that by simply cutting back the vegetation along the edge? And how much do we want to do that by putting in a simple rope fencing, on oak stakes, or something like that? So something that blends into the landscape that we've created. Um, so different. I'm not answering questions, I guess, so much as asking additional questions that we are always kind of thinking about as we're looking to manage our these landscapes. So that question of plant health, what works and what doesn't work, and this is an example of a rain garden that we were asked to come in and assist with. And they had two significant issues that were going on with this. One was that it's hard to tell on this image, but it's a really deep rain garden with a steep side, and the side was steep enough that plants were not establishing on that edge, and very few plants were establishing in the bottom of the basin because the water level was deep enough and the soil heavy enough that the water stuck around for a long time. And so one of the things that we did here was to shift this kind of uniform basin to a series of three staged basins. So there's the higher elevation area with a little bit of a berm that then overflows into a slightly bigger basin with a little bit of a berm that overflows into the final basin. And while it looks like there's a decent amount of water in here, still the water level drops quickly enough that we were able to get a lot of different sedge species and irises to establish in the low-lying portions of it. And by reducing the steepness of the edges, we were able to really get plants establishing well along the borders of the rain garden as well. So there's, this was after just a single growing season, but this site has continued to kind of fill in quite nicely. So again, kind of just thinking about what plants are appropriate for what sites, but what's the site condition like, and is it going to be appropriate for any plants that you would actually want to get in there, right? So that was one of the questions that we're asking through this process as well. That we saw that initially we had a site that was not going to be conducive to plants across, 70% of the site, 80% of the site. So we needed to tweak it in order to make it much more hospitable for a variety of different species. This was another site that we were asked to work in, and it had been nothing but gravel on top of weed barriers. And so what we did was we pulled out we pulled the gravel out and we pulled the weed barrier out, and we brought in a combination of compost and topsoil into the site. And then we mulched it and we planted it. And one of the unexpected outcomes for this was that yarrow in the sunny portions of the site just exploded. It was so happy with all the soil amendments that we put in, and I didn't have a good picture of what it looked like before we really kind of culled the yarrow and pulled it out, but it really kind of dominated, what had been this whole sunny portion of the site. So the shady area, this portion uh, through here was wonderful and kind of well behaved, given the soil nutrient levels that we added through the compost. And I think what we would do differently this time, if we were to do it again, is that we would have done a very different level of soil amendment in the sunny portions of the site, because so many more of our prairie species will do just fine in super mediocre soil conditions, right? So we could have created conditions for a more harmonious kind of interplay of plant species in the sunny portion had we backed off a lot in our soil amendments. And then just to bring up the idea of time and uh, patience, depending on kind of what we're looking at in our landscape. So you can see this fairly distinct line kind of down the center of this image. And the left side is a 3-year-old prairie that we had planted, and after 3 years, this client loved the site and asked us to plant another half acre to the right. And so we followed the same exact site preparation protocol, and we sprayed the site off for a season and burned it and then seeded it. And after a year, there was almost nothing. There was almost no native species coming up. Probably 99% of what we're seeing here is mare's tail, the agricultural weed that's now become kind of Roundup resistant. And there were occasional things like sand coreopsis and bee balm and black-eyed Susans that were uh, popping up in here, but very, very little. And we had a couple of other sites that we had seeded with similar soil conditions, and they were also doing really poorly after this establishment season. And I realized that we just had a really lousy season of weather for seed germination, and so what we had decided to do, with the understanding of the client, was to give it another season, to give it another chance for that seed that's in the soil to germinate. And this was actually just this season, so fingers are still crossed. But oftentimes when we're doing these prairie seedings from seed, the first season is really hit and miss, depending on what kind of germination weather, how much moisture we're getting during that first establishment season. So there is just an element of patience, especially when working with seed, as opposed to working with plugs or trees or shrubs. So what are some of the different techniques for site management? And I touched on some of these early on. And So fire, hand pulling, spraying, cutting and mowing, um, and then mulching and supplemental seeding and plugging as well. Fire is, I could talk about fire for eons. It's an amazingly valuable tool for our native landscapes, including our planted sites. So it's one that I definitely recommend people consider, and it is something that can be implemented at all scales. We burn, hundreds of square feet as opposed to much larger sites as well. Um, and most of our native species are really well adapted to fire. They thrive on fire. Fire needs to be timed properly in order to achieve the desired results. So this was an example of a woodland burn where there was an um, kind of an explosion of common buckthorn, and so we wanted to burn this area when there was still when there was a bunch of green in the leaves of the buckthorn, so that we would have maximum impact on those plants. And we did. We got a very high kill rate on the buckthorn. The timing is also really important in thinking about its impact on the native species, not just the weeds that we're looking to control. So this was a chart that was put together by Ryan O'Connor at the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, and basically it's kind of showing what uh, green is a positive impact, red is a negative impact, and yellow is not clearly impacted one way or another. And one of the things that you can see is, for example, fire's effect on our warm season grasses, big blue stem, little blue stem, switchgrass, Indian grass. It really stimulates them when fire is conducted in earlier spring or in fall. And it tends to knock them back when there's a growing season burn. Um, Similarly, or conversely, I guess, many of the wildflowers, the early and mid-season flowering forbs, are discouraged from burning during those times, but they're encouraged when you're doing a growing season burn. So there's, it's just important to kind of think about what the impacts are on our landscape when we burn at what time of year. Just one other element to throw out is cool season grasses are discouraged pretty significantly when fire is run through a site in spring and fall. And I point that out just because I think oftentimes one of the challenges in gardens of any size is turfgrass control. That there's always a lot of creep from our adjacent turf areas into garden beds or prairie plantings. So that was fire. Chemical control, spot spraying is an important consideration in a lot of contexts, especially when you get into a size of an area that's just too big for you to kind of go through and focus on hand pulling. So we do use chemicals a fair bit, and one of the ways that we try and minimize non-target impacts, non-target damage, is by adjusting the spray nozzle so that we make it much more of a stream if we're kind of hunting and pecking and looking for a plant here, a plant there. Um, we'll make it much more of a fine spray if we're trying to spray off of a large patch of Canada thistle, for example, or turf grass. But using the adjustability of the spray nozzle is really important for thinking about how to minimize damage to the good stuff. The other idea to to throw out your way is hand swiping, and we do this quite a bit when we're working in higher quality natural areas and high quality planted gardens and spaces where again, it's too big for us to go through and just hand pull. But in this case, we're spraying herbicide into our cotton gloved hand, and then manually kind of swiping that herbicide onto each of the stems that we're getting. So in this case, we were working in a series of rain gardens, and just on the other side of the shrub thicket, there's a big stand of Phragmites on the adjacent property, and that Phragmites is creeping in periodically. And so every couple of years, we go into the site and hit the 50, 100 different Phragmites stems that are popping up in this wetland. Just another example of that. So this was a prairie planting that we did through a combination of seed and plugs. So these folks wanted a more immediate impact than they would see with just seed. So you can see we went through and did a plug planting. There was just great moisture evenly throughout this growing season. And so the blue vervain, which is kind of the bluish purple flowers that are kind of scattered throughout the site, all that's from seed. And this is just in a single growing season. But within this site, there was a small area where there was a kind of persistent patch of Canada thistle, and so we went through during the ensuing couple years, and we just hand swiped and really kind of targeted the Canada thistle, and did it in a way that we didn't have any impact on the newly germinating and young growing native plugs. Mowing and cutting is an important technique as well. So this is a kind of a funny example of a site where there had been a large stand of teasel had been growing here, and so we spent 2 full seasons, two entire growing seasons, spraying the site off periodically. We would let it green up. We would let all the weeds germinate and grow, and then we would spray it off, and we would wait 6 or 8 weeks and do the same thing again. And then fall came after the second season of site prep, and we planted our native seed, and we got amazing germination across the site. But 98% of what we got was actually teasel. So what we're seeing, all these guys that look a little bit like young kale plants, those are all teasel, which is a pretty aggressive invader. There's definitely native stuff. You can see black-eyed Susans, started to flower. There's a little bit of bee balm scattered throughout the site, and so we didn't want to go back to the site and spray the teasel because we would damage the young native species that were coming in. So we recognize that teasel is a biennial, which means that once it sends up its flower stalk in the second year of growth, if you cut that plant off at the base, those plants are going to die. It's going to have used up so much of its energy that it's not going to be able to set another flower stalk on the site. And so each time this site gets to be a little bit of a sea of teasel, we'll go through and brush blade it or run a mower through it, again, just to kill the teasel. And we'll probably, in this case, have to do this for a couple of years before we shift the balance and allow the native species to really start to emerge. And once they become established and provide a lot more competition for the teasel, we'll see a lot less of the teasel coming up. And so we'll be able to use a pair of pruners and cut those plants at the base, or a weed whip, and again cut the teasel at the base, but not apply any herbicides to damage the newly germinating good stuff. We use that same technique with a variety of any combination of annuals and biennials. Sweet clover is another species that we do a lot of cutting those plants. So with all biennials, when that plant sends up its flower stalk and it starts to form a bud, in almost all cases, they've expended so much energy that if you cut them at the base, that's it. The plant is going to die without reflowering. So in a case like this, when we're going through prairies and cutting something like sweet clover, we'll leave the plants on site that we cut unless either the plants are dense enough that they're going to smother good native vegetation that's trying to establish, or if we've waited a little bit too long and we're into flowering period with those plants, and cutting the plants may still allow viable seed to form on the stalks. And so in those instances, we'll remove that cut material and compost it, take it off site. Hand pulling and is another important technique, and so this is actually a green roof that we were working on, and we're going through and pulling the shallowly rooted weeds that are on the site, so that we try and minimize any kind of soil disturbance, because we're recognizing that every time you pull plants out entirely, you're creating some level of soil disturbance, and it's weeds that are most well adapted to thrive in those disturbed soils. So we try and tamp down any areas that we've done extensive pulling, and then we'll go back and double check, those sites again and again throughout the growing season. Grass control, another significant concern with a lot of different sites that we work in, and as I mentioned before, I think oftentimes everybody is dealing with creeping grasses if you're planting adjacent to turf areas. And so one of the things that we'll do, we'll burn sites to discourage grass encroachment, as long as there's enough fuel to carry fire through those areas. If there's not, then we'll use the cool season growing nature of grass to its detriment, so that we'll target these patches of grass during cold weather when really only the grasses are actively growing. And so in November or in late February or March, on a 42 to 45 degree day, when these plants are actively photosynthesizing, we'll come out and do some kind of broadcast spray. And native species have, by and large, senesced for the season or have not yet emerged earlier in the season. So we try and use timing as an important tool for controlling cool season grasses. And then mulch is another one, especially with a cultivated type of aesthetic that we're looking for. So we'll often use mulch when plants are establishing, like when we're doing our initial planting. Both in many rain gardens, you can see there's a depression here. This is all a rain garden that's draining this downspout. And so what we talked with this client about doing is everything that's outside of the stone path will eventually kind of move towards just a wilder plant bed with no mulch. So this mulch will never get replenished. And in contrast, they want a more cultivated look in closer to the house. And so the plan is every 2 years or so, another layer of mulch will be brought in here, which will help to suppress, in particular, things like annuals and biennials. It doesn't replace the need for hand pulling or spot spraying, those types of weeding efforts as well. Just another mulched bed in a city park that the city will then go back and mulch on a regular basis. Um, and then just to point out too, I talked a little bit about sidewalk edges and planting edges, and just to point to, as you're thinking about planting, you can mitigate the flop factor by keeping a foot or so of unplanted areas along the edge of your planting, right? So that all these plants are going to be less likely to kind of spill into the parking lot in this case, because they're just set that much farther away from the paved surface. And then the whole idea we talked a little bit earlier about sometimes there is an ongoing need to edit and make additions over the course of time with new plugs or new seed to replenish or to increase the diversity of the site, and so that we see what is effective and what's not effective. And you discover a couple new species and you want to add those plants to your garden, that's a great way to go. These sites are always changing and emerging over time. And then I just wanted to wrap up with just some, if this is something you're interested in or something you're seeing, then try this. So if you don't want to have some of the aggressive native species, and I'm thinking about things like Canada goldenrod or common milkweed, they're rhizomatous species, so they tend to move quite a bit in planted areas. You need to stay on those things pretty early on. And once your landscape is well established, it becomes much more resistant to the spread of those species, those types of things. If you find that plants are a lot taller than you hoped in a particular area, they tend to get really leggy because the soil is richer than you might have thought, or it's moister, and so you get more growth. You can also cut those plants back in early summer, and the plants will grow just fine for the rest of the summer, but they're going to be a couple feet shorter than they otherwise would have been. So it's a nice way to have a little bit more of a compact appearance to your landscape. If you want a neater look to your landscape, you're really going to need to kind of plan on a regular basis to weed, to mulch, to modify your bed edge over time, and probably every couple years on the bed edge and on the mulching. This is one that we think about a lot when we're doing. We talk with folks who want to have kind of that mulched look, the more manicured look. If you mulch a bed, those plants that are there are not going to spread by seed, right? Because the seed is going to basically inhibit any kind of seed germination that falls beneath the mulch that you then add. So if you want the plants to fill in by that seed, you need to hold off on mulching and maybe just mulch around the perimeter, the outer edge of the site. We talked about cutting annuals and biennials in order to knock those guys down. It's great to leave the messiness of your landscape through the winter. They look beautiful, and you have the winter interest visually, but you're also providing great habitat for a variety of wildlife. And then just the other thought is, landscapes they generally get a little bit denser over time as the plants fill in, the biomass increases. And so if you really like the look of a more open site, a more open landscape, you will have to actively plan to remove or thin some of the plants over time. and that might be as simple as hand pulling or digging and moving plants and passing them to a neighbor. Um, it may be burning and eliminating the biomass and allowing, the new growth to come every year or two in that way too. And then I had mentioned this before we started, and I just wanted to say, totally unrelated to this, mile a minute weed just discovered in Albion in the last month. So it's not far from where many of you are in Kalamazoo. I'm just going to throw that out there for you guys to look it up online and then be on the lookout for it in your local natural areas. And with that, if there's time for questions, would love to entertain some.
Thank you, David. That was excellent. You certainly have a challenge in your job because you're dealing with people that have very diverse needs, very diverse habitats, scales of plantings, conditions. So it must be a tough job for you having to kind of satisfy all comers.
That's one of the fun things about it. It's that, not only are no two sites alike, but no two landowners are alike either.
Yeah, well, hats off to you for taking on that challenge. So we do have a few questions here, and there might be some more coming in here. So I'm going back to your earlier pictures. So you had a picture of the building that had stairs on it, that very early one. And the photos were from 2020, but we were wondering, was that planted several years previous? So the plants look quite large in there. How old were the plants in that planting when we saw those pictures?
Yeah, so these guys were mostly plugs. There were some quart-sized plants went in. And this site was planted in portions of it in late 2018 and portions of it in 2019. So these, this stage here is probably a year to two, maybe two growing seasons for some portions of it. And again, it's an incredibly nutrient rich and super moist area. So amazing growing conditions.
Okay, and then you had the picture of the Ann Arbor planting where you had the 2-foot mowed zone just to give it a neater appearance. So that looked that was very interesting to look at. Have you used that technique in other places as well?
We have. We use this actually a bunch. So generally anywhere where there's either a wild or cultivated landscape adjacent to a sidewalk, we will try and keep the edge as tidy as possible, just so we want people who are going by to not look over and say, "Oh, what a weed patch." We want them to and we think that if they're being accosted by the landscape, if they have to kind of fight their way through the vegetation that's spilling out, then they're less likely to look at the land, the wildness as favorably. So we feel like kind of their first experience should be an easy walking, and then they can look over and say, "Wow, there's all kinds of pollinators, and there's so many different cool wildflowers in there." So we use that quite a bit.
Yes, I'm gonna use that on our own wildflower planting at the college now, because I do find them flopping over the pathway, and I just haven't mowed them back. But I'm gonna try that.
One other
Another
thing,
neat appear.
and one other
Go ahead.
thought to add to that. So sometimes people are inclined when they're converting a big turf area over to a native landscape to leave a portion of that as turf and just mow the turf edge, or to have paths that crisscross through the landscape. and to keep those as the original turf and mow them. And
Mhm.
I discourage that simply because turf grasses tend to creep quite a bit. So it's much easier to plant the native vegetation right to the sidewalk edge, let that let those plants establish and mow them down and treat them as if they're turf, because that way they're not going to encroach on and degrade the landscape over time.
That's a great tip. Yeah. So another neatness one that you mentioned was mulch. Um, are there any particular types of mulch that you recommend, or any particular types that we should avoid using?
I would avoid using rubber mulch, which has now become a little bit more of a thing. We have had clients who have portions of their landscape that are mulched with rubber. Um, not, it's just a nightmare to work with. We usually use undyed shredded hardwood bark, and that's the mulch that you're seeing in a lot of these different um, mulched images. So that's this is shredded hardwood bark, which I think is wonderful. It really enriches the soil nicely. We usually put it on about 3 inches thick in order to hold moisture into the plants, um, and do effective weed control. And then over about a 2 year period, that mulch will decompose and enriches the soil really nicely during that time.
I've
We
also found some interesting fungi growing in the mulch, like these little bird nest fungi and stuff. So they're nice habitat for other things as well.
Yeah, that's really true. There's some pretty amazing fungi will establish, and especially if you're getting a nice moist period.
Mhm. We had a couple of questions on herbiciding, spraying. So one of them was, um, where can I get the glove used for hand swiping? So you mentioned a cotton glove. So I assume you put that cotton glove over a rubber glove or something.
Yes. So this is super high tech, where this is a dishwashing type of glove. I think this one is probably a 10 mil thickness, which is so. But uh, dishwashing gloves are herbicide resistant, and then the cotton glove that Mick is wearing here is just one of the super basic cotton gloves that you can find at a hardware store. It didn't start blue like that; it was bright yellow, and we add a blue dye to our herbicide. You can see in the backpack that he's got uh,
Oh,
the blue dye in the herbicide, so we know what plants we've treated and which ones still need to be treated. So cheap, these are $1 a pair cotton gloves over the dishwashing.
Okay, great. And when you're spot spraying, and you're trying to minimize the collateral damage by narrowing the stream, do you try to get complete coverage, or do you use like a concentrated squirt just on the crown of the plant?
Yeah, it's a great question. We generally try with most species to hit about 50% of the foliage if we can. Um, that generally seems to be about what's going to kill most species. Um, and and some of them are easier to do that on, especially before they've sent up their flower stalk. So something even like spotted knapweed, right for the first month of summer, they hug the ground and they've got their nice basal rosettes, and it's nice and compact. And a quick spritz will you'll easily hit 50% of that vegetation. But with some of those species, again, like spotted knapweed, once they bolt and send up their flower stalk, um, the foliage is it's much more spread out, and so harder to hit that 50% unless you're doing hand swiping. And if you've got a big field of spotted knapweed, that's a tall order. You can't go through and hand swipe very effectively. So timing is definitely important with a lot of different species. One of the other things that
But you wouldn't use
I would
anything more concentrated, like you're just using your standard dilution that you would use for foliar spray.
exactly, yeah, regardless of whether we're just hitting the basal rosette or whether we're hand swiping, we're using that same dilute solution. Um, the other thing that I would just say in terms of being aware for spot spraying or any kind of herbicide control is that we really try and think about when those plants before they're flowering to have little or no impact on pollinators that might be flying around and using them. So, bees and other critters are all attracted to, generally much more attracted to those species when they're in flower. And so, if we can do our control work uh, at the time of season, just before the plants are flowering, will have a significant impact on the plants, no impact on the various wildlife species that might be using those plants.
Mhm. And another herbicide question: what kinds of herbicides do you recommend?
So we generally go with kind of two basic options for 90% of the things that we use. We use wetland formulations only. So a wetland formulation of glyphosate, and the one that's most readily available now is called Rodeo. And then we use a wetland formulation of a broadleaf specific herbicide, and that one is, I think the trade name that we're using now is Garlon 3A. And again, the Garlon is broadleaf specific. So if we're treating in an area where there are native grasses and sedges, um, we will only use the Garlon in order to protect the graminoids. Because if we can get out there and spray and have no impact on a big swath of the native species, that's a great way to go.
Mhm. I see someone posted triclopyr. Is that
Yeah,
another name for
triclopyr.
one of the ones you mentioned, or that's something different?
It is. So triclopyr is the active ingredient of the Garlon. Yep. So and there are a handful of different formulations, and then the thing um, that we add to both the glyphosate, which is non-selective. That's kind of the Roundup is the most commonly known one. But we add a surfactant, which helps the herbicide stick to the vegetation and penetrate the cuticle, the leaf cuticle, that much better. And we use a product called Scythe. Sorry, no, we use a product called Cygnet, Cygnet, and that's also wetland approved. So you can use these chemicals, right up to the water's edge.
Mhm. And so that's what you mean by the wetland formulation, then, is it that you can use it near wetlands?
That's exactly right. Yeah. It's been shown to have much less of an impact on amphibians, reptiles, various aquatic organisms.
Mhm. And one final here, one on so if you have a turf area and you want to convert it to natural to native wildflowers, what techniques do you recommend for killing that turf grass?
Yeah. So it depends a little bit on what the history of that turf grass was. This was an example of a site that had this subdivision had been applying broadleaf herbicides to this turf. So there was no weed in this grass. It um, it was nothing but turf grass. And generally speaking, turf grass is it. The grass itself is a lot easier to kill than the weeds that might otherwise grow in probably most of our lawns. So in this case, we sprayed the turf grass. We waited about 3 weeks to see what we missed, and then we resprayed it again. Uh, and then we, in this case, we actually waited for about 2 months, and the turfgrass that we had sprayed off decomposed during that time. And the decomposition allowed us to seed directly right onto into the newly sprayed areas. If you're spraying an area that you don't get such rapid decomposition, burning off the sprayed patch is really effective. Um, Equally effective, but much less fun, is you can go through and rake the entire area and thin the amount of thatch that you have. Because what you want to do is make sure, if you're using seed, you want to make sure that you have good seed soil contact. And if it's very dense turf, it'll prevent the seed from working its way down into the top quarter inch or so of soil. If you're doing a prairie establishment in a much weedier lawn, then I recommend taking an entire season to prepare that site. So spraying it generally probably 3 times over the course of the season at about 6 or 8 week intervals.
Mhm. Do you ever lay down landscape cloth and then plant into that? So kind of try and smother the turf grass
We
or other plants?
we generally don't use black plastic or landscape fabric, and in large part with the landscape fabric, it's similar to mulch in that if you're looking to have a landscape that will eventually further fill in by seed, that landscape fabric will prevent seeds from they'll root, but they won't be able to send roots down beyond that barrier. So we will sometimes do plug plantings using what we call sheet mulching. So we'll take cardboard, thick cardboard, and we'll smother the turf with cardboard, lay mulch on top of that, and let that sit for usually 6 to 8 weeks. And then the cardboard will smother the turf, and then we'll use an auger or a hand trowel and punch holes through the cardboard. And that's an effective way to non-chemical approach to doing landscape installation.
Mhm. And one final one then on English ivy. How do you get rid of English ivy?
This sounds like the start of a joke, and it's not a very funny joke.
No.
No. So English ivy is really tough. English ivy and winter creeper, and to a lesser degree myrtle, right? They all have kind of the thick, waxy cuticles, which makes herbicide a lot more resistant. It makes them more resistant to the herbicide. So what we do with uh, is one of 2 approaches. You can take a propane torch and torch the English ivy, and you'll kind of kill those stalks, which will stimulate new growth of those plants. And those young plants don't have that same thick, waxy cuticle, and so they're much more susceptible to herbicide. Um, and so we'll use, for all of those, we would use Garlon, the triclopyr, the broadleaf specific herbicide. And in those cases, we add a different surfactant that's called Scythe, SCYTHE, and that Scythe is it's organic acid is the active ingredient, and it helps to kind of burn through that thick, waxy cuticle. Scythe is not wetland approved, so you have to use it in higher, drier areas. But it really increases the efficacy of the herbicide on English ivy. And then usually it'll take, probably, if you don't do the propane torching, it'll take at least 2 herbicide applications.
All right, lots of great information there. One person asked, would your slides be available as a handout? Lots of great information.
I guess if we can figure out a way to do that, I would be.
Yeah, I can talk with you later about that.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be happy to share.
Yeah. Or maybe some of the tips that you shared on herbicides and stuff that, more as a handout or something that we could post.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
All right. Yes. Well, thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over now to Neil to close things up.
All right. Thank you, Dave, for a great presentation. Reminder to everyone that tonight's program was recorded and will be on the Kalamazoo Area Wild Ones YouTube channel. Also, don't forget to check out our Facebook page and website for more information on our programs, membership, and more. This was our last program of the year, and the next program is on Wednesday, January the 27th at 7 p.m. The program is titled Bumblebees, Blossoms, and Boots on the Ground, Propelling Pollinator Conservation Through Citizen Science. Our speakers are going to be Nikolai Nixon, Nicole Bailey, and Ann Frazier from Kalamazoo College. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next year. Good night.